I'm going to start with a short video.
And dipping now, some new information and disturbing information just into us. The New York Times now says that 4 of its journalists reporting on the conflict in Libya have gone missing.
4 journalists, 2 reporters and 2 photographers for the New York Times disappeared on Tuesday.
Editors say they have not heard from Anthony Shadid, Stephen Farrell, Tyler Hicks, and Lynsey Addario. 4 New York Times journalists were held captive. They'd been reporting from the eastern city of Ajdabiya. The Times executive editor says the paper has been in contact with the Libyan government, and they were assured that the 4 would be released promptly if they had been captured.
Libyan authorities said the group was captured in eastern Libya last week by forces loyal to Colonel Gaddafi.
The message I would give is that they were reporting the conflict there, then unbiased. They were covering hospitals, the front line, everything, and obviously, you know, it's tough. It's tough to now, you know, to sit here and not know, you know, what has happened.
So a lot of people ask why I decided to become a war photographer, and I grew up in Westport, Connecticut, not the most likely place to breed a war photographer. This is me when I was about 2 years old with my father. And let's see, I was the youngest of 4 sisters, probably the best training I could have had because they beat me up every single day of my life. And when I was 26 years old, I moved to India. And I was renting a room from the Dow Jones bureau chief there, and he was working in Afghanistan under the Taliban. And he said, you know, you're a woman and you care about women's issues. Why don't you go to Afghanistan and cover women and see what they think about living under the Taliban? And I said, oh, that's a great idea. So I had no money, of course. I called my sister and borrowed $2,500 and called my mother and said, I'm going to go to Afghanistan tomorrow. And she said, okay, honey, have a good time, because this is before September 11th. She had no idea what that meant. So I learned very quickly how to use my gender to my advantage. I had access to women. This was a society that was completely segregated by gender. So I went to women's homes, and I photographed secret girls' schools that were prohibited under the Taliban. Girls were not allowed to be educated. I went to secret weddings. This is in a basement in a house in Afghanistan in Herat in the west. And I walked downstairs and the Titanic was blasting and people were dancing around. It was not what I expected to see. And this is a woman in labor under the Taliban in one of the women's hospitals in Kabul. And many of the doctors and educated had fled. And women were left with very few resources. Let's see, this clicker is a little slow, so I'm sorry. In 2003, we knew that we were gearing up for the war in Iraq, and I wanted to be there. I still had no combat experience, but I raised my hand and said, I'll go to northern Iraq and see if there's a humanitarian crisis. Maybe Iraqis will flee to the north when the troops come in. So I went into northern Iraq and waited for Saddam to fall. And in early April 2003, he did fall, and I went down to Kirkuk and saw these incredible scenes of elation. Iraqis were so happy that he had fallen. This is in one of Saddam's palaces. Saddam had routinely taken the water from most of the country and relegated it for his own use. People went in and, as a form of rebellion, started swimming in his man-made lakes and pillaging from his palaces. But quickly the horrors of the war became unveiled. There were mass graves across the country. This is south of Baghdad, and what you're looking at is in every white sheet is a body, and people would try and find the remains of their loved ones. It was the first time that they could do this because many of the Shiites were massacred under Saddam, and they weren't permitted to go look for their loved ones. And people were frustrated because while there was a plan to overthrow Saddam, there was no plan for his aftermath, and so they started protesting in the streets. There was no water, very little electricity, they couldn't get money out of the banks, no gas for cooking. And this is a woman looking for her husband in a fire at a gas factory in Basra in southern Iraq. Because of all of the looting across the country, fires were often inadvertently started and people were wounded, and this is a woman looking for her husband. I wanted to see what the American troops thought, so I started doing my first military embeds, and I went with the troops in the middle of the night into the heart of the Sunni insurgency and watched them round up men that they deemed suspicious and put bags on their heads and zip ties on their wrists. And in 2004, Life magazine sent me to photograph the wounded coming out of Fallujah. This is one of the biggest battles of our generation. And I was suspicious about the access I would have because as a journalist, I hadn't seen wounded soldiers before. And I went in and we were able to witness everything, the wounded coming out. This is how a young man was flown to Germany for treatment. And I sent all the pictures to Life magazine, and they held them for 4 months. And eventually my photo editor wrote me and said, I hate to tell you this, but I don't think we'll ever publish your pictures of wounded coming out of Fallujah because my editor doesn't think the American public can handle them. Of course, I was furious, and I said, how dare you send me to war if you don't think if you don't have the guts to publish these photos. So luckily, the New York Times Magazine did end up publishing them. In 2004, the only way into the cover the war in Darfur was to sneak in illegally across the border. I was working with Somini Sengupta for the New York Times, and we walked from neighboring Chad. We got in and we met up with the rebels and traveled around for about 5 days on the back of a pickup truck. There were villages that had been burned to the ground, people who had been displaced, and I went back every year for 6 years. Some years I snuck in illegally, sometimes I was able to get a visa, and moved around often with aid organizations on the ground. And in 2006, I was working with Lydia Polgreen for the New York Times, and we had heard there had been a massacre of Sudanese government soldiers, and President Bashir denied it. He said absolutely no government soldiers were killed. And so we jumped on the back of a pickup truck with rebels once again, drove across the border about 2 miles in, and we saw bodies clear across the desert. These are all Sudanese government soldiers. To me, this is the power of an image. It's not fake news, as we often hear. This is what journalists do when they cover war. They risk their lives to get proof. In 2007, I was working with Elizabeth Rubin for the New York Times Magazine. We wanted to know why so many civilians were dying in the war in Afghanistan if we had arguably the best military in the world. We went to the public affairs officer and said, hey, we'd like to go to the Korangal Valley. It was the most dangerous place in the country at the time. And they sort of looked at us and they said, you know, it's not really a place that's fit for women. And we said, why not? And they said, well, there's no place for you to go to the bathroom and no place for you to sleep. We convinced him, obviously, otherwise. We were flown in and spent 2 months walking through the mountains at about 7,000 feet with the troops, often under fire. We were mortared, shot at almost daily. And at the end, we went on a 6-day Operation Rock Avalanche where we jumped out of Blackhawks on the side of the mountain and walked for about 6 days with everything on our backs. At the end, we were ambushed by the Taliban from 3 sides, and 3 soldiers were shot, and this is Sergeant Rugel's body being carried across the mountains. In 2009, I won a MacArthur Fellowship and started documenting maternal health and why women die in childbirth. And this is in Afghanistan. The woman on the right was in labor. Her husband's car had broken down, and arguably she could have died if she didn't make it to the hospital. I made a decision to drive them to the hospital, and I only took about 3 frames while shooting this. In 2011, it was the uprising in Libya. And I had missed the Arab Spring in Egypt and in Tunisia because I was working in Iraq, and I asked the New York Times to go into Libya. Like Sudan, we had to sneak in from neighboring Egypt. And when I got there, there were these very familiar scenes of euphoria. The rebels setting up a parallel government in Benghazi in eastern Libya. And then there was a call to arms, and teachers, doctors, engineers, people who were totally untrained to go to war, threw on everything green in their closet and went toward the front line. And of course, the photojournalists went with them. And I spent about 2 weeks covering very, very heavy combat on the front line in Libya. And we were often sleeping in people's homes. There were no hotels open. We traveled with them as cities fell. And the front line kept pushing back and forth, east and west. Sometimes the rebels would gain ground, and sometimes Gaddafi's troops would gain ground. This is in Ras Lanuf, where there was a very strategic oil refinery. And sometimes we would just listen to the sound of a plane, and everyone would stop and look up and wait to see if a bomb would fall. And it would fall literally 200 feet from where we sat. And so for 2 weeks, I was covering the fighting. And on March 15th, 2011, I was working with Tyler Hicks, Anthony Shadid, and Steve Farrell for the New York Times. And we knew that the town of Ajdabiya was going to fall, so we positioned ourselves there, of course, and we covered the fighting, and we were in 2 cars. And one of their cars, the driver's brother was shot at the front line. So he stopped the car in the middle of the battle, dumped all their stuff on the side of the road, and suddenly 4 journalists for the New York Times ended up in 1 car. We had a driver, Muhammad, who was quite young, and we had to make a decision of how long to stay in that town, knowing that the front line was about to fall. We saw civilians fleeing for their lives. We decided to go back to the front line to cover the fighting, and then went to the hospital to count civilian casualties. At that point, we got a call that Gaddafi's troops were in the city. That was a great risk for us, of course, because all of the journalists had entered illegally who were working in the East. And Gaddafi had repeatedly said, if you see journalists, kill them. They're all spies. So finally, after quite some time, we made a decision to pull east toward Benghazi. And as we were driving out of the city, I saw actually Gaddafi's troops on the horizon, and I said, those are Gaddafi's forces. And everyone in the car sort of laughed and said, there's no way, they're behind us. Well, they had flanked the desert and cut the road in front of us, and we drove directly into one of Gaddafi's checkpoints. This is the place we were stopped, where you see the word Brian Denton. That's where our car was stopped. Muhammad, our driver, panicked and jumped out. We were all pulled out of the car. We eventually made it to the other side of the street where that building is because the rebels we had been covering started opening fire on that checkpoint, and we were caught in a wall of bullets. We were told to lie face down in the dirt, had our arms put behind our backs, and we had rifles put to our heads. And we thought that was the moment of our execution. In the end, they did not shoot us. They tied us up, blindfolded us, placed us back in vehicles in the middle of the road, and we were held for the next 3 days at gunpoint, repeatedly threatened with execution, tied up, blindfolded, and me as the only woman, I was groped repeatedly. And then on the 3rd day, we were transferred to Tripoli, where we were held for another 3 days and eventually released to Tripoli. Brian Denton went back 2 weeks later to help find the body of our driver. He was never seen again, and we assume he was killed in that moment. And the only thing they saw was my shoe on the side of the road. I told my family I wouldn't go into Syria when the Syrian war heated up, so I started covering Syrian refugees in all the neighboring countries, Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, and I did eventually go into Syria a couple of times. And this is during the ISIS invasion of Sinjar. And most recently, I've been working on a year-long project with Time magazine called Finding Home, where we've been following 3 Syrian refugee families through the asylum process, all of the 3 women were pregnant when we met them, so they've all given birth, and we spent the first year of their babies' lives with them. That was for Time, and it's been published throughout the year. And these are some of those photos. And here are a couple pictures of me on assignment, just to see what I look like usually when I'm working. This is Fallujah, crossing illegally into Darfur. In Darfur. Afghanistan. That's the little one. I'm the little one on the left. Yeah, Afghanistan. 7 months pregnant in Gaza. Libya. That's about 2 days before we were captured. That's it. Thank you.